Welcome back to No to NATO. I'm your host, Simeon Boykov, also known as the Aussie Cossack, broadcasting to you live from the Russian consulate in Sydney, where I am in captivity, self-imposed captivity, should I say, for 2 years now. And of course, it's a pleasure to host the show tonight, organised and founded by George Galloway. No to NATO plays a very crucial role because it spans all across the world, different continents. We reach audiences in the UK, United States, Canada, Australia, NATO countries, G7, G20 countries. And the message is very clear: no to NATO, no to war. There is a multitude of people, and you're probably one of them if you're watching, who oppose NATO aggression, who sympathise with those countries who are holding the line against NATO. Today's episode is an alarming episode. The world is very close to World War III, very close to Armageddon. In fact, the Russian Patriarch of Moscow, Patriarch Kirill, reminded his people to not fear nuclear Armageddon. He reminded Orthodox people to not fear the end of the world. And that's the kind of rhetoric now that the Russians are using in preparation to answer the provocations of the West. And it is the West that is provocating. Russia is simply reacting. Last week, sources in the New York Times reported that the United States potentially could be planning to give Ukraine nuclear weapons. This could be some mad last attempt by the Biden administration to throw a spanner in the works, to create World War III, and to ruin things not only for Trump, but for the whole world. Because Vladimir Putin was very clear in his response. He said that if Ukraine was to receive nuclear weapons, Russia would use everything at its disposal to counter that. Let's have a look at what Vladimir Putin said. Breaking.
I think if we speak about the common sense, if we are involved in the hostilities with the country that is becoming a nuclear power, if that's the case, we will use I would like to emphasize this, every means, every weapon at our disposal. We will not let this happen. That's one. Two, such statements can only be done by people who are irresponsible, who are not responsible for anything, and they carry no burden of responsibility on their shoulders, responsibility neither for their country nor for the world in general. Three, if someone is giving something officially, then it means that it is going to be a violation of all the obligations assumed under the non-proliferation of the mass destruction weapons treaties. As for Ukraine itself, we will follow every step of theirs.
Now, Putin is very clear that if someone was to give nuclear weapons to Ukraine, Russia would respond, unleash everything. Not only conventional weapons, not only the now famous Oreshnik missile, which has caught the world's attention, but of course Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons if there's even another suggestion that someone is going to give Ukraine nuclear weapons. Now again, Russia does not want Ukraine's destruction. Russia does not seek to use nuclear weapons. And the reason we know that is because they haven't used them yet. Of course, Russian troops take casualties. The ratio is about 9-1 compared to Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainians lose far higher casualties on the battlefield. But Russia is very clear that that would be overstepping the red line. Speaking of the Oreshnik missile, Russia's new missile, which it has tested, Vladimir Putin also said and warned that using the Oreshnik missile, multiple missiles at once, would be really the same effect as a nuclear weapon. So Russia can either use nukes or it can use several Oreshnik missiles that would have the same type of effect as a nuclear blast. Now this is a person, one man on the planet, Vladimir Putin, who holds that power, who yields that power, but he is very responsible. You know he's a gentleman, you know he's responsible because he can, but he doesn't. Rather than use them, he is happy to commit his country to conventional warfare. Now, conventional warfare is very difficult. Conventional warfare is what our great-grandfathers did in World War I and World War II. It's grueling, it's bloody, it's difficult, it's hard, it's very high casualties. But that is the sacrifice that Russian troops are making and the Russian people is making. the Russian economy is making. We know that just this week, the ruble has been devalued very hard to the point of about 110 US dollars to a ruble. In Australian dollars, it's about 74 rubles to a dollar. Russian interest rates are very high, as much as 35%. Why does Russia have to tolerate this? Why does Russia have to tolerate sanctions? So you can live. So you watching in the West can be safe. I know that sounds ridiculous, but if you think about it, it makes perfect common sense. Russia is not using nuclear weapons. Instead, it's going down the hard path, the difficult path, and it's opting for peace at the expense of a conventional war. Now, we know that President Trump has only a few weeks till he steps foot in the White House. And this is why we've seen this rhetoric increase. The Biden regime on its way out, they're trying to slam the door. Not only slam the door, but destroy cave in the whole structure as they leave, to leave Trump with a mess. But I think, honestly, Vladimir Putin and President Trump, I think they understand each other. And many people in the United States, many patriots in America are hoping and secretly asking and openly asking, we've seen the rhetoric on social media all over X, they're asking for Putin to just wait and hold on, to not do anything until Trump enters the White House. Now, Trump himself has made a promise to take apart the warmongering lobby in the United States, in Washington, in the State Department, in the media, people like Jessica Newland. Let's have a look at what Trump had to say about this.
World War III has never been closer than it is right now. We need to clean house of all of the warmongers and America last globalists in the deep state, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the national security industrial complex.
Well, he said it. He said it. He's going to clean out the warmongers in Washington. And these are the warmongers, the Hillary Clintons, the Jessica Newlands. These people are satanic. They're sick. These people thrive. When they killed Gaddafi, these people were laughing and watching. When they bomb the Middle East and Africa, these people sit in the Pentagon, they sit in the White House in boardrooms, and they watch it unfold on TVs, and they laugh. They enjoy themselves. And I hope that Trump is sincere. And I do believe he's sincere because Vladimir Putin also believes Trump is sincere. In fact, Vladimir Putin warned that Trump needs to be protected. He needs to be protected because he is in danger. He is at risk of assassination. They do not want Trump to make a deal with Putin. And Trump has repeatedly underscored that he will make a deal with Putin in 24 hours. So on the 20th of January, 2025, when Trump enters the Oval Office, it should only take 24 hours for this conflict to finish. Enough is enough. See, it's British Storm Shadow missiles, which Ukraine is supposedly launching at Russia, and we all know that's not true. It's the British launching them, pretending it's the Ukraine launching them. French missiles, German missiles, American missiles. But the retaliation, the mirror response, when the Oreshnik missile is launched by Russia, as we saw last week in response, it's not going to hit the British or the French or the Germans or the Americans yet, of course. It's going to hit the Ukrainians. Now, massive Russian missile strikes took place yesterday. About 190 missiles and drones were launched all over Ukraine, hitting critical energy infrastructure. And of course, now entering winter, it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians in winter. But who cares about the Ukrainians? And I'm asking that as a question. Who cares about them? Jessica Newland doesn't care about them. Jessica Newland doesn't care. And Trump admitted that Jessica Newland and her friends in the State Department, they were responsible for the regime change in Ukraine. They were responsible for the Maidan of 2014. So we need to stop this. In fact, what did Trump say? I quote, he said, Jessica Newland was responsible for pushing Ukraine towards NATO. They're big words, they're serious words. I mean, is it just me, or does it appear that Trump is not sympathetic to NATO at all? And I hope he's not, because NATO is the key evil, the key enemy of people all around the world. Even those countries which are in NATO, in a sense, they are also victims because they are forced to hand over a large part of their GDP to buy weapons which they don't need. And the Ukrainian conflict was a perfect situation for NATO military-industrial complex bankers and private companies such as Lockheed, such as Krupp, such as, of course, BlackRock, to make more money. Surrender all the old weapons, donate all the old weapons to Zelensky, and we will make you buy new ones to replace them. That's the business model. And that's why they needed Ukraine. At the end of the day, they do not care about Ukrainians at all. I guarantee you, nobody in Washington cares. And the people you see on social media with Ukrainian flags in their bios, in fact, you see less and less of them these days. They're either Nazis, let's just face it, they're either Nazis, or they're people who are just going with the current thing. Now the current thing is over, and there's less and less of them. It's very good to see that Americans are waking up. Americans are saying not one more cent, no more money to Ukraine, to Zelensky. Because look, let's face it, the money doesn't even reach Ukraine. The money doesn't reach Ukrainian civilians. I mean, Ukrainian civilians are suffering, but they're suffering at the behest of Zelensky, at the behest of the Biden regime, which is now in its dying days, thankfully. So look, the world is in a dangerous position, but I have full trust, I have full confidence in Russia, in Vladimir Putin. He is simply reacting to what the West is doing. And they're under immense pressure, the Russians. It's a huge responsibility that Putin carries on his shoulders, and you have to hand it to him. He's doing a very good job. He just recently visited Kazakhstan. He was greeted like a boss in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan, one of the major countries that made up the Soviet Union previously, pivoting towards Russia, showing its loyalty, not receiving Zelensky, but receiving Putin. The other Soviet republics, Georgia now becomes pro-Russian. Romania, a new government is forming in Romania, another pro-Russian government sweeping to power. And all around Europe, we have parties coming to power which are very sympathetic to Russia and very unsympathetic to NATO. Now, NATO really should not exist because the only reason it was created was to counter the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. Why does NATO continue to exist? Because it's a business model. It's simply a business model. It's very good for those people who have shares in Western military companies. Continue deploying weapons, building weapons, forcing countries to buy those weapons, use them in battle, and then replace them again. Ammunition, shells, artillery, tanks, everything needs to be used up and cleaned out. And Ukraine is the perfect place for that. I mean, the numbers are staggering. Something like 15,000 tanks either side have been destroyed. These are huge numbers. This is more tanks have been destroyed in the NATO, Ukraine, Russia conflict than in all the wars since World War II combined. It's a very scary statistic. But again, Russia has managed to preserve a sense of normalcy in society. If you go to the Russian cities, things are going as normal. Things are functioning as normal. Prices are normal. Stores are fully stocked. The shelves are fully stocked. Despite sanctions, there's no really price gouging. People are living normally. People are working, making money. Families are living life as per normal. And that is the brilliant and the genius approach which Vladimir Putin managed to take on. It was a very fine line. He couldn't commit Russia to full war, to full mobilization, to put the people or the country or the economy at an inconvenience. And that's why, in a way, it really is not a war but a special operation. God forbid if it should become a full-blown war and Russia should announce full mobilization, it would be a completely different story. But the problem for the West, now I'm going to put myself now in the shoes of a Western observer, a Western analyst, or a Western expert, or an American, British, you could say NATO patriot, because true American and British patriots are against NATO. Now let's just call it a NATO patriot. Let's pretend I'm now a NATO patriot. If I'm a NATO patriot, if I'm for the deep state, I should be very, very worried. Why should I be very worried? Because Russia was a quiet country, just plodding along, exporting its wealth, investing it overseas, all the money from oil and gas and gold and diamonds and timber and precious metals and rare earths. All the money Russia was making all these years since 1991 was cleverly being exported and sent overseas to the West. Up until now, up until this conflict started. Thanks to the sanctions, all the money stays in Russia. Russia becomes stronger. That's bad for NATO. That's bad for the West. Russia's military is now producing so many tanks and missiles that they haven't been producing since the days of the Cold War. In fact, the latest statistics show that Russia is producing quadruple of ammunition and weapons in comparison to all of the EU put together. You take all the EU countries, Russia is making times 4 of all those countries put together. Why? Because NATO's aggression. Russia didn't want to do this, but Russia is doing it, and Russia's doing a great job. So really, NATO's aggression is making Russia great again. It's turning Russia into what NATO always feared. All they had to do was leave Russia alone. Trade with Russia, do business, make money, allow Russia to be friends with Ukraine, allow Ukraine to be a pro-Russian country. What was so wrong with that? What was wrong with Ukrainians and Russians being friends? What was wrong with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church being in communion, being together, praying together, as they have done for 1,000 years since 988, when Rus was baptized in the river Dnieper? What was wrong with that? Nothing wrong with that. And the only reason why Russia, or the Soviet Union, shall I say, granted independence and agreed to give independence to all these countries is because the Soviet Union knew that these countries would be friendly. Do you really think if Joseph Stalin, after World War II, if he had a crystal ball to look forward to 2014, and he knew that NATO would come into Ukraine, he would not have left Ukraine anything. He would not have built anything for Ukraine. And that is the great tragedy of this situation, that NATO has turned two Slavic nations against each other, brothers fighting brothers, cousins fighting cousins, villages fighting neighboring villages. They've brought up a generation of Nazis in Ukraine, unfortunately. They've brainwashed Ukrainians to the point where they're causing genocide of the Ukrainian nation, a self-imposed genocide. It's not the Russian government who is arresting Ukrainian men on the streets and dragging them off to the front line to their death as cannon fodder. It's not the Russian government. It's the Ukrainian government at the behest of NATO. And now there's talk of lowering the mobilization age from 25 to 18. Now they want 18-year-olds in Ukraine fighting. And it's very corrupt. It's very sad. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. I often repeat this. There is only one country in the world that actually cares about Ukraine. And you can guess what country that is. That, of course, is Russia. That is the only country that cares about Ukraine. Look, at the end of the day, on tonight's show on No to NATO, we'll be exploring what options we have with moving away from war and moving into a more sensible, peaceful solution. If we can get there, we only have to really last, I think, in my opinion, to the 20th of January. So look very closely, watch very closely as to what the West will do. We'll be joined now by professor and author Dan Kovalik. He's a freelance photographer. So stay tuned for that. Also, we'll be joined by distinguished guest Dean O'Brien. He's a former Special Forces and trade unionist in Britain. And of course, later on, Workers' Party Great Britain Deputy Leader Andrew Hudd. Without further ado, we'll welcome our first guest tonight. And we'll get straight into it on No to NATO. Dean, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's show. How are you today? Dan. Just a slight technical issue. Can we get Dan's microphone on? Just try again, Dan. Can we hear you now, Dan? Please go ahead.
I can hear you. I'm here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and really happy to be on your show.
Fantastic. Well, you're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Let's start with the elections that were passed. Pennsylvania was a key state. It was a very important state. And what can I say? Can I congratulate you with Trump's win?
Well, I actually voted for Jill Stein. I voted third party. But, you know, in the end, I think Trump's victory was important to this extent. I think it's very clear that those of us who would not vote for Kamala Harris because of the genocide, I think our votes either for Trump or third-party candidates or not voting at all became very determinative in the election. I think that's true in Pennsylvania, which, as you say, may have been the most important state. In fact, judging by the fact that both Kamala Harris and Trump had their last campaign rallies in Pittsburgh, my city, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, shows they certainly thought it was important. And I do think that a lot of people, particularly in the two big cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, who have been sickened by this genocide, just refused to vote for Kamala because of her role in that.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying. I completely understand that from the point of view of trying to stop and prevent the further genocide that's taking place in Gaza, that neither Trump nor Kamala were ideal candidates. I understand that. I agree with you. But can I ask you, in the broader picture of things, if we take into consideration the geopolitical situation around the world and the relationship between the Israel-Gaza conflict, or as you say, genocide, and the Russia-Ukraine-NATO situation, another genocide of the Ukrainian people, by the way, do you think there's a potential where there is a deal on the table made between Putin and Trump, which encompasses all conflicts at once? Because I highly doubt that Putin and Trump will meet and they will say, all right, let's fix this, but leave this on fire. Let's continue war here, but let's stop war here. Do you think there's a big solution to this, a deal on the table? And what would that look like, hypothetically?
I think it's possible. And let me be very clear. I do think that the American people, many of them voted for Trump because they do want peace. And they do want peace in Ukraine. And they do want to stop funding Ukraine. In fact, there was just a poll taken. Most of the American people, by a slim majority, like 51%, want to end the war in Ukraine, do not want to keep sending arms to them. So I do think that the victory of Trump did represent a vote for peace in Ukraine. And he said things to the effect that he would end the war in 24 hours. And there does appear to be some communication between the Trump incoming team and the Putin administration, which is all to the good. You know, Biden, not only did Biden never talk to Putin, certainly not in the last 2 years, he ordered everyone in his cabinet not to talk to their counterparts in Russia, which is completely insane. I mean, we didn't even see that during the Soviet times. With all that said, I mean, I think we'll just see what Trump's actual policies will be. Obviously, some of his appointments, like Marco Rubio, don't give me a lot of warmth. But look, I do think that in the end...
What can you tell us about Trump's appointment of General Kellogg? General Kellogg, a special envoy for Ukraine. What do you know about that appointment that was made?
Well, I don't know a lot about his history, but I have taken note of the fact that he has talked about wanting to increase aid to Ukraine. There appears to be some, a tendency within the Trump administration that believes in de-escalation through escalation. That essentially they think they can end the war by being willing to escalate it and to pressure Russia into taking a deal that the West can't approve of. I think Kellogg may be of that ilk, which is concerning. I think we've had...
Kellogg is just an envoy, so we can assume that Kellogg will represent Trump's position, hopefully. And maybe, yes, previously Kellogg has been involved in funding Ukraine, but as you rightly said, most Americans, and it's so clear on social media, You look at the comments, what people are saying. In fact, right now, if you read the comments, Christine Peach is writing, heck no, Russia is not to wait for Trump. Russia must do what is needed to Russia. For Russia. People are saying no more funding, not one more cent. So something's changed in the United States. It's good to see. It's good to hear. It's good to read. Kellogg will probably represent what Trump wants. So, I mean, what does Trump want? I mean, if Trump had a magic wand, in your opinion, as an expert in this field, what would he do? What would he ask his general Kellogg to do when Kellogg goes and speaks to Putin and Zelensky?
I think he does want the war to end. I do believe that. I do think he wants to stop the hemorrhaging of the treasury on Ukraine. The question is going to be what terms he wants. You know, terms he's going to insist on. I'm not sure what those are going to be. You know, my own view is that he should not insist on Ukraine keeping all of its pre-SMO land, particularly the Donbas. By the way, I've been to the Donbas 5 times in the last 2 years. I believe you've been there as well. I'm certain that the people in the Donbas do not want to.
It's very impressive. 5 times in the last 2 years. So you've risked your life, really, to travel to the war zone for the sake of your journalism and your campaigning for people.
Yeah, for peace. I mean, I see myself as a peace activist, as a citizen diplomat, and I feel I understand the people in the Donbass, and I know they do not want to return to Ukraine. They feel happy to be part of Russia and feel safer now that that they are part of Russia. And I don't think they're going back. Obviously, the Crimea is not going back. And certainly, again, any insistence on such a thing would be not only a non-starter with Russia, but I don't think it would be the correct move because, as we know, in my view, the government in Kiev gave up any claim to the Donbass and to Crimea when they started attacking their own Russian people within Ukraine in 2014. Now, again, I don't know what. And I don't know if Trump will insist on that, what he'll insist on. We know, and it's important to remind your audience, we know there was a deal on the table just about a month after the SMO started in February 2022 that both sides appeared willing to accept. And that deal would have allowed Ukraine to keep all the lands it's lost since the SMO began. And it's also clear that the United States and the UK intervened to stop that peace deal from happening. And I think, again, that deal's no longer on the table. It's no longer a possibility. So the key question, I guess I don't have an answer. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. I do think Trump wants to end the war. The question is, will he insist on those lands being returned? That's going to be the big question.
Well, you said it yourself. You've been there 5 times in the last 2 years. And for the sake of our Western audience who are watching, did you meet anyone in those Russian-held areas, in the Donbas where you traveled? Did you meet anyone that told you they would like to return to Ukraine?
I did not meet one person who had that view. Everyone that I met
5 times in the last 2 years.
Yes, since the SMO began. I've been to Donetsk 3 times. I've been to Luhansk. I've been to Kherson. And I have not met anyone in those areas that want to be part of Ukraine anymore. They felt betrayed by Ukraine after the U.S.-backed coup in 2014. They were physically attacked. As you know, 14,000 people died even before the SMO began in the war between Kiev and its own people in the Donbass. And the people don't want to go back. And in any case, the truth is, and I believe at least 500,000, and this is an old number. The last I checked, at least 500,000 people in the Donbass hold Russian passports. It's probably much more now, but I know that's the last time I checked. It was 500,000 people. My guess is it's a lot more. They can now freely travel between the Donbass and mainland Russia, I guess I'll call it. which they like to do. So, yeah, there's no question. And again, I'll just give one example of also, if you want proof from how the markets work. Real estate went up big time in Donbas. The prices went up after Russia intervened and after the people of the Donbas voted to go back to Russia, which I think is somewhat.
Speaking of real estate, one of the greatest things that Russia did in those areas where Russia liberated the people from the Zelensky government, all loans, any mortgages, any loans, business loans, anything that the people had, any obligations, in fact, car loans even. Putin said that he was asked about this, and he said, well, if those Ukrainian banks don't want to recognize that territory as being Russian, well, why should we recognize their claims to any assets in those territories? So everyone who's living in those territories are very, very happy to see Russia. They got basically clean slate, wiped all of their loans, and now they're receiving Russian wages, Russian pensions, which are far, far higher than the Ukrainian ones. And Russia is injecting billions and billions of dollars into these new areas, into huge infrastructure projects, roads, anything. Really, I know from people that are over there and working in these businesses that any project you can put to paper, which is marginally sensible and makes sense, will get funding. The Russian government has basically said, we're going to pump this place full of money. We're pumping Donbas full of money, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Crimea. These regions, in terms of population, are not very large compared to the rest of Russia. But in terms of national and federal importance, Russia is throwing everything at these regions. And why would Russia inject billions of dollars into those regions if Russia was planning to abandon them or hand them back or give them over in some type of a negotiation deal? Of course, they wouldn't, which is why I agree with you. Russia's not going to hand anything over. Russian blood was spilt. People fought for that land. Not only Russian soldiers, but let's rewind, Dan, to 2014, how local civilians, men, women, students, miners, coal miners, factory workers, taxi drivers from Donbas, from Crimea, from those regions, in Mariupol, even Odessa, which is still under occupation. People rose up against the Poroshenko Nazi regime of that time, and many of them were killed. Many of them are still in prisons, being tortured, simply because on the 9th of May, on Victory Day over Nazism in World War II, these Russian people, Russian-speaking people, wore a St. George's ribbon or laid a wreath of flowers to a monument to Soviet soldiers to honor victory over Nazism. And this is all they've done wrong. Simply spoke Russian, simply had a Russian last name. So Russia was completely entitled to save its people, to protect its people. And I can say, and I think we all know this, we all understand this, if Russia didn't intervene, if Russia didn't protect its people, Russia would not be held in high regard, not only by its own people, but people around the world. I mean, people respect the fact that, as they say in Russian, «Русские своих не бросают», which means Russians never abandon their own. And Dan, thank you for traveling to the Donbas. Thank you for putting your life at risk. Thank you for visiting Donetsk and all those areas where there are Ukrainian bombings and shells and HIMARS missiles and ATACMS missiles from the United States hitting civilian targets. You've put yourself on the line for truth, and for freedom, and for standing up for what's right. We appreciate that, Dan, and we appreciate your time on No to NATO. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
We'll continue now. We've got an excellent guest lineup to get through. We'll jump straight over now to the United Kingdom. Dean O'Brien is joining us. Dean O'Brien is a freelance photographer who spent the last 15 years traveling around the world to different countries, including Russia. Dean, welcome to the show tonight.
Oh, cheers. Thank you for inviting me on.
Dean, tell us, look, it's always great to get a perspective from a Westerner who's visited Russia. When was the first time you traveled to Russia? What year was that?
I traveled to Russia in, I think it was 2012. 20, I believe. So yeah, that was my first time in Russia. That was 12 months after I first went to Donbas in May 2019.
And since then, how many times have you returned?
I've only been to Donbas the one time. That was in 2019, and then after that, I've been traveling to Russia and to other countries that are kind of affected by this conflict. So, for example, the kind of photography and reportage that I do, you try and find a niche. You know, I could, for example, go to Moscow, but there's lots of Westerners there. They're doing their own angles. So what I did was I've travelled to the PMR, which is the Transnistria Moldovan Republic, which known as Transnistria in the west. We know that at some point that region will play a massive part in this conflict with its connection to Odessa, obviously. I've also just earlier this year travelled to Kaliningrad, which we know is constantly in the news at the moment because this is where they believe this is where the missiles, should it go nuclear, will be fired from.
Well, very interesting. Look, I've always been fascinated with Transnistria. I've never been there myself, but it's this little piece of the Soviet Union which was preserved. Everything seemed to race on ahead in time, and Transnistria was like this unique museum of Soviet infrastructure, culture, and optics. And of course, as a photographer, you would have seen the optics there in Transnistria. Plenty of hammer and sickles still around, plenty of Soviet sort of banners and architecture and things like that. I've only seen photos of the place, but it's a remarkable territory that's sandwiched in between Moldova and Ukraine. And of course, I personally, as well as many others, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, I would love to see Transnistria joined with Russia physically with a Russian border. And that should be the frontier. Transnistria should be the western frontier of Russia. And it has been holding the line. Transnistria has been resisting these assimilation processes, not assimilating into the West, not assimilating into Moldova or Ukraine, even though it's sandwiched in between these two countries. And it's got a lot of Russian troops there, stationed there. There hasn't been any fighting yet. But I do agree with you that will become a very important strategic place. I mean, they've got massive ammunition dumps there, huge, the biggest ones in Europe, Soviet-era ammunition dumps, which will become important.
Yeah, they have. I mean, it really is an amazing place, and anybody that wants to go can go. There's no visa required, so you just go through a Russian checkpoint. They're fine. You get a migration card, but it is amazing. I mean, it is like the Soviet Union. There's Lenin monuments, there's hammers and sickles everywhere, and it's quite strange, really, how without Western interference. I mean, it's broken up into kind of like thirds, really. You've got a third Russian population, a third Ukrainian, a third Moldovan, and they all get on fine. And they all get on fine, just like
That's
they did.
They all get along. There's no infighting.
Exactly, because there's no Western interference. And this reminds me of how Ukraine was when I originally went about 15 years ago. You had Ukrainians there that kind of saw themselves as Ukrainian. You had Russians there that saw themselves as Russian. And you had this mix now because obviously there's more women than men in Ukraine. So a big situation there was people would have Ukrainian mothers, Russian fathers. And it was never an issue. A brother might see himself as Ukrainian, the other brother might see himself as pro-Russian, and it was never a problem. Not until the West went there, started to interfere, and as we know, once the Maidan happened, it turned brother against brother.
You said it perfectly. I fully agree with you, and it is a tragedy. Look, I've been to Western Ukraine. I've been to a city called Chernovtsi, Bukovina, on the border with Romania, and similar situation. You've got Romanians, Moldovans, Ukrainians, Russians, and this is, of course, before the war. I was there in 2008. And everyone is happy. Everyone is friendly. Everyone gets along. And there was none of this animosity. This was all started in 2014 when the West, when Jessica Newland, when all of these satanic influence from Washington from people like Hillary Clinton. They brainwashed the Ukrainian population to hate Russians. They brainwashed them. They even invented a new church for them. For 1,000 years, Russia and Ukraine have been in the same church. In fact, what am I saying? For 1,000 years, Russia and Ukraine were the same country. Ukraine only was invented in 1991. And they even invented a new church. And now Zelensky has outlawed that old, ancient Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, closing down churches, arresting bishops, arresting priests, arresting nuns. This is what Zelensky is doing. And of course, we do know that Zelensky himself is not Christian. He's not Christian. He does not believe in Jesus, doesn't believe in God. And how he became the leader of a 92% Christian country, Christian Orthodox country, is absolutely outrageous. And there you go. That's the problem that we're facing. It is very sad. But look, you would have seen, and as I can attest to, there was no animosity before. These people, these countries, Transnistria, Moldova, Russia, they should have been all together. They always were together. In the Soviet Union, they were together. And after the Soviet Union, they were still together. They were friendly. And now it's all artificially being done by NATO, by Western influence. As you correctly said,
of course.
Those areas which do not have Western influence, they flourish, don't they?
Exactly. I mean, you have to remember as well, there's two ways of looking at this. Like, I travelled to Ukraine backwards and forwards for 15 years. My last visit was in May for Victory Day 2018. I went to Mariupol. There, the police were harassing people that were trying to lay wreaths with St. George's ribbon, anything like that. So that was kind of like my last visit to Ukraine. But there's two ways I'm looking at this, really. Ukrainians, in a way, I do feel sorry for them because of the way situations happened. But I witnessed the Maidan and I witnessed the build-up to it, okay? So they brought, a lot of them brought this war to their own door, okay? You can be as sympathetic as you like, but they brought the war to their own door. And they invited America, they welcomed America with the Maidan. And, there's this old saying, if you invite a pig to dinner, don't complain when he puts his feet on the table. And this is what's happened. They've invited America in, and now it's all going pear-shaped for them. They're not really sure what's going to happen. Trump's coming in. Biden, as you know, is going hell for leather now. He's throwing everything into this, thinking that whilst he's still in office, he'll be able to pull something out of this. The only thing they're going to pull out there is more bodies out the rubble, because there is no win in this for Ukraine. No win at all.
Look, I can guarantee everyone in the West thinking and watching what happens if we just let Russia, so to speak, have its way and complete its special operation. I can guarantee you that is actually the best and most humane course of action the West can take, is to just say, right, Russia, do what you were going to do. And what was Russia going to do? All they wanted to do was demilitarize Ukraine and denazify Ukraine. They don't want Nazis on their border. They don't want ATACMS, HIMARS, Patriot missiles on their border. They don't want biolabs on their border. I mean, that is not unreasonable. What the Russians wanted is not unreasonable. And that's all the Russians want. Russia doesn't need extra land. Russia has enough land. Russia has enough everything. I mean, they got so much undeveloped land back at home all over the country. And if anything, these new regions, it just brings a budget deficit. It doesn't actually bring in. But guys, we've got a great audience tonight. Large numbers watching on all platforms. Massive. I want to say thank you to a huge audience. And we are live on YouTube. We're live on TikTok. We're live on Rumble. Live all over the place. We're live on X. We're live on George Galloway's platforms. We're live on Anti-NATO's platforms. We can see all your comments in the comment section, and we'll read a few of them out now. Jenny Lynn says, the US demands full submission and will not allow any competition. Emily Lightfoot from Australia. Welcome, Emily. She's one of our great old listeners, old viewers from the days of the Aussie Cossack channel. It must be terrifying time to be a civilian in the Ukraine at the moment. Talking about mobilizing women and 18-year-olds, killing old women who would rather wait for the Russians. I mean, Dan, this is something that the West needs to understand. Old people in Ukrainian cities, when they hear that the Russian army is coming, instead of running, they buckle down, they go into their basements, and they wait. They wait for the Russian army. And they say, at the Battle of Avdiivka, at the end of the battle, there were people emerging from the basements. when this battle went on for months and months and months, bombing, everything destroyed, and out of the rubble emerged civilians. And the Russian troops were shocked that these people they would rather risk living through a battle, a modern warfare battle with drones and artillery and tanks and serious weapons, fab bombs. These are massive bombs that are going off. And these Russian people and Ukrainian people, because they're the same, for us they're the same. They would rather sit in a bunker and wait the battle out than live in Zelensky's Ukraine. And what does that tell you? What does that tell the West? Shouldn't that tell them something, Dean?
Oh, of course it should. I mean, we should never forget that 27 million Soviets sacrificed their lives to, so that we're talking today, basically, and defeated Nazi Germany. So that's the spirit that they've got, and it will never change.
Then on that point, and that is the spirit, and because Russians honor the spirit of their ancestors, they honor the heroes of the Great Patriotic War, the 27 million who died fighting the Nazis, because there is that sense of intergenerational honor, the respect and remembrance. It's very strong in Russia, very strong. 9th of May, Victory Day, is probably the most important day of the calendar. And because there is that mentality, that's why now in 2024 and next year in 2025, more Russian men will stand up, get off the couch, kiss their wives goodbye, march down to the recruitment office and go to the front lines, because they know that they too will be honored. They know that they are fighting and dying, not only for a country, but for a phenomenon, for a intergenerational spirit. They are joining the ranks of the heroes, who are honored every year. And that's what the Westerners understand about Russians. You can kill Giwi, you can kill Motorola, you can assassinate somebody, you can take out our heroes, our leaders. Doesn't matter. They live forever, and more will replace them. Putin is old, and it doesn't matter. He dies of old age in 10, 20 years, many years to him, as they say, много лет нашему президенту, as they say in Russian. But it doesn't matter, because Putinism will live on. And what is Putinism? What is Russia? That's that spirit. That's honoring our ancestors. That's honoring the blood that was spilled. And it's sacred. Where in the West do you see that type of honor of veterans these days? Which country? Name a country. Less and less emphasis in the West is put on military parades, and more influence and more emphasis is put on parades of another nature, which we won't even mention on this show. And that's the degeneracy which is happening in the West. And people are shocked when they go to Russia and they see young people wearing military uniforms, laying wreaths at monuments, and singing patriotic songs and praying in church, and people having families and having children and believing in their country and believing in God. This is the thing. The West does not believe in God anymore. They're turning their backs on God. They've turned their backs on themselves. They've turned their backs on their parents, on their great-grandparents, on their ancestry. I mean, most people, unfortunately, look, I live in Australia. Anzac Day parades, they're getting smaller and smaller every year. There's less and less interest and emphasis on patriotic ideology, because the globalists are taking over the West, and the globalists are trying to stamp out this type of patriotism. But Dean, I think it's incredible that you've traveled to all of these places. One day I also wish to travel to Transnistria, to that part of the world. And I want to thank you for your excellent work that you've been doing as an ambassador for peace between the nations, between Russia and the West. And let's hope that soon, once Trump enters the White House and they meet with Putin, that they will rectify this terrible situation which has enveloped over the years, and return things back to normal, and people can get back to raising families, raising children, and being healthy, and worrying about their lives instead of worrying about survival. Thank you very much, Dean, for joining us today on No to NATO. Let everyone know, please, where can they find you, and where can they view your photographs from Transnistria?
Well, they can go onto my Twitter feed. It's at DinoBino1. They can find me on Twitter, or if they just type in Dean O'Brien, Russia or Donbas, it'll come up with my username. So they can find my work on there. But like most photographers, they have to take into account that a lot of my stuff is ghosted. You know, I'll put a post on there and it just doesn't seem to appear on the feed because we just go through that restriction now.
Thank you, Dean. Look, one day I think we'll defeat big tech and their censorship also. There's no reason why your work should be ghosted or why our work in general that we do should be censored. Big tech is part of the problem. The big tech allows the deep state to get away with the crimes they get away with by silencing ambassadors for truth and freedom such as yourself. Dean O'Brien joining us from the UK. Thank you very much. Moving on now. One very important thing I'd like to bring up now. You would have seen a QR code, guys, on your screens. That's the No to NATO QR code. Now, I'll tell you why it's very important to subscribe, follow, and donate to No to NATO. Now, this is not something which I often ask for, but this is important. Why? Because Russia cannot fund this program. I can't fund this program. Vladimir Putin can't fund this program. Russia Today can't fund this program. Could you just imagine if Russia Today was funding this show or the Kremlin was funding this show? Now, for us to be able to broadcast in the West, for us to be able to bring you the other side of the story, it's important that it's crowdfunded and it's only crowdfunded. And we'll continue bringing you No to NATO, updating you with the latest information on this war. There aren't many programs like this in the West. There should be, but there aren't. The reason there aren't because they're being censored and hammered everywhere. Thank God for George Galloway and his team. They're still there. They're still in the game. They're still fighting. And that's why it's a crowd-funded exercise. So if you feel strongly about what you're watching tonight, if you connect with what we're saying and you want more of this and you want more of this type of, let's just face it, propaganda against NATO, because there's nothing wrong with saying that. We're entitled to propagate information against NATO. We're entitled to say no to NATO and stop NATO. Because if we don't, who will? Who will say that? And I know there are many people all around the world in BRICS. There are billions of people around the world who really want this. They really want a stop to NATO. NATO should be disbanded. NATO should not exist anymore. In fact, Vladimir Putin himself said, why doesn't Russia join NATO? And NATO was like, well, what do you mean, Russia join NATO? And Putin said, well, yes, Russia joins NATO. And then what's the point of NATO? So there you go. That's how we can fight NATO, by donating now to this QR code on your screen. Don't forget, the people who are fighting, the people who we're broadcasting against, these people are funded and armed with billions and billions of dollars of your taxpayer money, by the way. So here we are. We're the little guys. We're fighting in the corner, but we're doing a good job. Thank you to the team in Bristol and Birmingham and our international audience all watching now. Hit subscribe, hit follow. But enough plugging the show. Let's continue with the content tonight because we've got some excellent content. I can see all your comments on the screen. Hector's house, the USA has 800 military bases abroad. Colonialists, indeed. I mean, I'm glad people are waking up all around the West, and it's important we continue the pressure. We do not stop the pressure. Moving on to another guest from the United Kingdom. His name is Andrew Hudd. He's a former Special Forces soldier. He's a trade unionist and the Workers' Party of Great Britain deputy leader. He's the vice president of the ASLEF trade union. And it's a pleasure to join him to the program today. Andrew, welcome to No to NATO.
I wish I was Special Forces, but I was Royal Navy. But almost as good.
Royal Navy. Royal Navy. Yeah. Well, let's start with that. What rank exactly, Royal Navy? Where did you serve? What ships did you serve on? Because I'm always fascinated in this type of things, the British Navy and history. It's very interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I served in the 1990s, so and I was on the big ships. I was on the aircraft carriers. Done a few tours here and there, and retired when I got to Oz. Funny enough. Put my notice in when I got to Oz, but yeah, I was seeing the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, done 3 tours down there, but had enough after 9 years.
I like that song, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, ever shall be slaves.
That's right. Yeah, well, the Navy...
Did you sing that song often?
Oh no, we had other songs, Cossack, other songs, but no, that when the Navy back then, even then was underfunded and not as good as it could have been. But the people I served with were amazing, very well trained, good guys, and we're seeing the change in the armed forces at the moment, where we just got rid of 2 more ships in the Royal Navy, which is sad. We got more admirals, vice admirals, and rear admirals in the Navy now than operational ships.
Well, that's obviously a bad thing. Meanwhile, China now has 1,000 frigates, 1,000, and they're building more and more and more. And by the way, thanks to Australia, who is exporting iron ore, which is sent directly through Port Hedland, of all places, by the way. Shout out to Port Hedland and Adrian McRae. All that iron ore goes to China, and China is building the world's largest navy, the largest surface fleet. So China is becoming very, very strong, and we will see where that leads. But look, let's talk about, Andrew, the sentiment in the British military. There's a lot of talk lately about the British going to war against the Russians, and in fact, British troops being put on the ground in Ukraine. One of those people who is agitating for this is the warmonger Boris Johnson. Now, Boris Johnson, let's have a look what he had to say about this only yesterday.
I get back to my earlier question. We are, let's face it, we're waging a proxy war. We're waging a proxy war, but we're not giving our proxies the ability to do the job. And for years and years now, we've been allowing them to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, and it has been cruel. It has been cruel, and we need now to give them what they need. So 3 things we need to do. To get this thing done, we need to give them the weaponry they need, give them the permissions they need, give them all the military support, logistical, tactical, we can, that without coming into direct conflict with the Russians ourselves. Number 2, we need to give them the money, and I've talked about the 300 billion. But number 3, we need to make it, so we need to get absolutely, and by the way, we should do more than just the 300 billion. We should construct a kind of lend-lease loan for Ukraine, and $500 billion or whatever, so that Putin knows. This is all about Russia knowing what the end state is. To get back to my key point, the Ukrainians, the Russians, the world has to know where we, America, UK, Europe, want this thing to end up, and we have allowed that ambiguity to drift on and on and on. And that is the whole problem with Ukraine. Unless and until we clear it up, you won't persuade Putin to back down, and you won't get a peace.
Who is this homeless man with an untidy physical appearance and a rough hairstyle who calls himself Boris Johnson? I mean, Andrew, did you hear what he said? He literally said, we should give them $500 billion or whatever. He literally said $500 billion or whatever. He's literally making up numbers and saying, let's just give them whatever. It doesn't matter, 300 billion, $500 billion. This guy is crazy. Boris Johnson started his little rant there by saying, let's face it, we are waging a proxy war. Well, I'll hand it to him. At least he's being honest. At least he's admitting that the British are waging a proxy war. I mean, look, you're a British naval ex-serviceman. You're very active in politics. You're a patriot of your country. You love Great Britain. You served your country. How does it make you feel watching Boris Johnson there?
Well, it's just laughable. I mean, like you said, he's just pulling out numbers and figures. And I think, by the way, welcome to our former Prime Minister. The current one isn't much better. He's going around, his mouth is writing checks that the armed forces can't cash. Like I said, the armed forces are loyal, they're well trained, and thankfully now, more recently, they're well equipped. But you can fit them into Aston Villa Stadium. There's no way on earth that we could, enter into conflict with Russia in any way. That was refreshing for me. That was the first time I've seen that the fact that Boris Johnson said that this is a proxy war. But unfortunately, in this proxy war, Well, estimates vary, but 600,000 working class Ukrainians have died. You know, countless hundreds of thousands of Russians, no doubt, have also died. The effect on working people, aside from the money that's going to go and be spent on weapons instead of hospitals and schools, is staggering.
Well, look, how do you feel, and how would British soldiers feel about being deployed on the ground to fight Russian troops face to face in the trenches?
Well, do you know what? They will do it. They will do whatever they're told to do, which is, of course, what you expect of them. But you know what? They're not stupid. Yeah, even when I was serving, we're human beings, and you sit in a mess room with other people who are going into conflicts and war zones with you, and you're not stupid. You understand what's going on there, and you know when something's right and you know when something's wrong, and I imagine that conversation is happening in the mess rooms and barracks of every UK serving personnel across the country and at sea at the moment. And I bet you they won't be looking forward to that. But they'll do their duty because they're good people.
In fact, just a few days ago, there was a British mercenary captured in the Kursk region. And we're not talking about Ukrainian regions which are not recognized by the West as being Russian territory. We're talking about legitimate Russian territory, pre-war Russian territory. We've got British servicemen or British mercenaries being captured. Now he's captured as a prisoner of war. And of course, that gives hope to people like me who are in a position where potentially I would benefit from a international prisoner exchange deal. I would happily go to Russia from Australia, where I've been locked in the Russian consulate for the last 2 years. But that's another story. British troops on the ground, mercenaries, they're called mercenaries, they're called instructors, but let's just face it, they are British troops. And it's British infrastructure, it's British weaponry, it's British intel, it's British command, British planes, Air Force that are coordinating these strikes, that are doing patrols on Russia's borders around Kaliningrad, around the Black Sea. So the British really are completely involved in the war already. And when people like Boris Johnson say, we need to escalate because we can win if we escalate, I don't believe him. This is the same thing they've been saying. If we rewind to the beginning of the conflict, remember what they were saying? Oh, we just need to give them javelins and they'll be okay. Okay, they give them javelins, nothing happened. We just need to give them Challenger tanks and then Ukraine will win. Okay, they gave them Challenger tanks. Well, nothing happened. Russia destroyed them or captured them. We need to give them Leopard tanks. Oh, wait, nothing happened there either. Then there was, we need to give them Abrams tanks. And there was all this talking about Abrams tanks. Then we said we need to give them Storm Shadows and then we'll win. That didn't work either. Remember they said F-16s, give us this, give us that, give us another 100 billion. So it's a never-ending story. The truth is there is no wonder weapon. There is no weapon in the British military, the German military, the US arsenal. There is nothing they can give to end the war. It doesn't work like that, does it? The front line is 1,500 kilometers long. It's the biggest front line anywhere in the world since World War II. And they think by sending 10 tanks, 20 tanks, I mean, the United States provided 31 Abrams tanks. Australia has now pledged 49 Abrams tanks. But out of the 31 Abrams tanks that the US already gave, about 23 of them already destroyed or captured. So the moral of the story is there is no wonder weapon. There is no level of escalation. There is no amount of money, like as British former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was quoted saying there, 300 billion or $500 billion. There is no magic button. There is no amount of money or amount of weaponry, in my opinion, that will change anything. The only thing that's going to do is prolong the suffering, prolong the dying first and foremost of Ukrainians. That is the problem here. And that's not what we want. We, as in Russians, we do not want Ukrainians to die. It's the West, in fact. It's people like Boris Johnson. He doesn't care how many Ukrainians die. He gets his photo opportunity with Zelensky. He gets to appear on the media and make brazen statements and commit more money. Again, it's not his money. It's your money, Andrew. It's the Workers' Party's money. The people of Britain who pay tax to the British government, to the Crown, it's your money which is being sent to Ukraine. for no reason at all. It's literally sponsoring the death of Ukrainians. Because look, if they just stop the weapons, if they stop the money, if they stop NATO's involvement, things would go back to normal. But in terms of your role in the trade unions, just before we go, because we're running out of time, but I want to ask you, do you see some potential for trade union action in terms of logistics of weapons routes, weapons exports to Ukraine and weapons supply? Is there some type of potential action? And we have to be careful here. We don't want to put you in the hot water with the British government. They'll claim you're inciting riots or something like that. But what's wrong? You know the rules. You're allowed to do strikes. The trade unions still exist. Thankfully, they're not banned or outlawed yet in Britain. Is there scope for some stop NATO, no to NATO, anti-war action with the trade unions in the ports?
I'm afraid not. Short answer, not a chance. And that's because the trade unions, the whole movement is on its knees. We've just had a series of strikes over the last 2 or 3 years that have kind of improved matters somewhat. But generally, the trade union movement is, it's politically bankrupt. It has no idea where it's going. In fact, it's the Labour Party that steers the trade union movement. And there have been glorious stories in the past where trade unionists have stopped working trains, stopped putting containers on boats, stopped weapons going to conflicts around the world. But we've got a genocide in Gaza, and not one weapon has been stopped leaving this country. Not one weapon part, not one bit of machinery. The wheels of industry have still turned to supply the parts for the F-35 that are carpet bombing Gaza and killing tens of thousands of women and children. And so, no, I think Ukraine is well down on the list of what could be done. Like I said, the trade union movement is in a woeful state at the moment, and it needs to change. I'm afraid to say that.
Look, I'm very keen on some type of coordinated international no to NATO action. And I've spoken about this before, mentioned it to the Honourable George Galloway. And I think that it's something we need to do because we live in the West. We live in countries like the UK, Australia, United States. I think we'll find a lot of support for people who would like to march and protest against their own government's warmongering policies of supplying weapons and money and troops, essentially, troops as well, to Ukraine. And that's something that's in our power. That's something that we can do. And I know a lot of people would love to put their name to a no to NATO rally, to march in a rally like that. So when their grandchildren ask them, well, what did granddad do during the Russia-Ukraine war? You can then boldly say, I marched against it and I did something against it. And if you want to do something against it right now, if you want to get involved in the informational war by helping sustain broadcasts such as this, make sure you scan the QR code no to NATO and you can support from there. And also by leaving a comment in the comment section below, hitting subscribe. And look at some of your comments right now. Captain Blimp says, Boris Johnson is American, born in New York and sent to British public school to acquire that pretentious upper-class accent. I didn't know that. Dean, do you agree with that, Andrew, that Boris Johnson was actually born in the United States?
Well, if that's true, that would tie it all up, wouldn't it? It'd explain a lot of things. But the man's a buffoon.
Well, that one, I want to alleviate the shame. It's not your shame, it's the US shame.
No,
no comment. I don't comment on Boris Johnson's appearance anyway. I mean, Boris Johnson, he shouldn't be allowed in public with the way he looks. Christine Peach says, many people are moving to Russia to live among people who want to live in harmony with each other. And just on that note, it's true. There are many Westerners moving to Russia, and many Westerners are interested in moving to Russia. And often I get asked, if I want to move to Russia, where do I go? What do I do? Who should I ask? It's sometimes very difficult to ask the Russian embassy or ask your Russian consulate because they don't speak English and they're not very, they're very sort of bureaucratic in their approach. But there is one agency It's called OKA Agency. Search them on Google, have a look. They'll help you with moving to Russia, getting Russian citizenship, just for those people in the comments who are wondering. But look, I absolutely have had a pleasure speaking with you, Andrew, and it's good to know that we have allies, and you should know that you have allies in Australia, all around the world. There's many of us who think this way, whether we're from the left or whether from the right. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that we stand for the truth, we stand for freedom, we stand against the deep state, we stand against NATO. So thank you for your great work. My regards to all the former servicemen that you served with also, who no doubt are watching this broadcast tonight. And it's good to know that the British veterans are not enemies of Russia, that they do not consider Russia the enemy. So thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, guys, wrapping up tonight's show, you see the differing opinions from a range of British and international journalists, commentators, political leaders. It's very clear that they do not consider Russia the enemy. And when you break through the propaganda of the Western mainstream media, and we actually start digging into the truth and scratching the surface of reality, we understand that we are many in our resolve. And we do have friends all around the world. And eventually we will defeat the deep state warmongers. Trump said it himself at the beginning of the show. We played you that clip, that he wants to get rid of the warmongering faction in the State Department, in the media, in Washington. And it's great news for Australia, where I am at the moment, because Australia seems to follow whatever the United States says. And how will Anthony Albanese and the Australian government, Richard Marles, the Australian Defence Minister, react when Trump says, stand down, enough is enough? Maybe those 49 Abrams tanks, which Australia has pledged to Ukraine, maybe they won't even leave Australian shores. And I'm sure the Australian government is very careful and very quiet to covertly load them onto ships as to not let the general public know where those Australian tanks are being sent. I mean, how can you send 49 Australian Abrams tanks overseas when that's all Australia has in storage? The new tanks, which the Americans are promising the Australians, haven't even arrived yet. There's a couple of them, but the 49 Abrams tanks is a formidable amount of hardware. On paper, at least, it makes Australia look formidable when we compare Australia's military to other powers in the Pacific, such as China and Indonesia. If there was ever to be a conflict in the future, Australia would need those tanks and will be shedding crocodile tears. So the message is, don't supply anything anymore to Ukraine. Enough is enough. There is nothing. There is no weaponry that can change anything. The Russians are on a mission. The Russians are going to denazify Ukraine. They're going to demilitarize Ukraine. They're going to liberate the Ukrainian people, and they're going to rebuild Ukraine. And that is the end of the story. There's nothing else that anyone can change. If you try to give nuclear weapons to Ukraine, as the experts have suggested, and that has been floated in the New York Times last week, you saw Putin's words today. He will use everything necessary. He will unleash everything on Ukraine if Ukraine was to get nukes. That would be a suicide mission. In fact, even talking about Ukraine getting nukes is a disaster. So, if you care about Ukraine, let Russia finish the job. And we can all get back to peace and harmony and rebuilding and moving forward and saving the world and saving the animals and saving the volcanoes and the bugs and the beetles or whales or whatever cause you want to fight for. But don't fight for this cause. Don't fight for the NATO cause. Don't fight for the warmongers cause. Find another cause. Find another cause. Back it, stick to it. I know that probably not many people on this show watching are sympathetic to the Greenies. That's probably a bad example to use. Workers' rights, how about that? Go for workers' rights. Fight for whatever you like, but just don't fight for NATO. You must fight against NATO. You must make a stand. If we don't make a stand, there won't be a world to enjoy. Because if this continues, if they arm Ukraine with nuclear weapons, it's going to be a disaster. The Russians are not bluffing. The Russians will launch everything. We've seen what Oreshnik can do. Oreshnik is a very formidable missile. I love seeing your comments in the comment sections. Jacqueline Tackerberry, absolutely love seeing Aussie Cossack here. Mike Rao, thank you very much for your great comments. You know what's fantastic, guys? It's been years since I've been on YouTube. The Aussie Cossack channel was taken down at the height of the lockdowns. We had plenty of great videos with the police and the Australian movement against the government oppression here and the tyranny. And I just want to say a big shout out and a big hello to all the old Aussie Cossack subscribers in the comments section. Can read your comments, can see your comments. Thank you to George Galloway for the opportunity to co-host this very important, excellent show known as No to NATO. In fact, it's not just a show, it's a movement, because there is action planned, industrial action, streets, protests on the streets, political action. And it's a very important movement. Thank you to the team behind No to NATO. And if you want to support that team and those people who are behind the production of this type of propaganda, let's face it, because there's nothing wrong with propaganda when it's for the right cause, scan the QR code and support the show. Thanks very much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. I'm the Aussie Cossack, and you've been watching No to NATO.